The first thing I noticed about him wasn't his face. It was his hands. He had them spread flat against the hood of my car, fingers splayed like he was trying to feel the metal breathe, and the knuckles were scarred in a way that told you they hadn't just opened jars or typed emails. These were hands that had done things that left marks, things that required force, things that maybe couldn't be taken back. The scars were pale against his skin, some old and silvered, others newer, still pink at the edges. I cataloged them the way I catalog everything. Professionally, clinically, as if he were a painting in need of assessment. I was still holding my parking validation ticket from the parquet on King Street West. The air smelled like exhaust and old concrete, and the specific dampness that Toronto does so well in October. That wet leaf smell that settles into your bones and makes you want to stay indoors forever. I remember thinking very clearly, the way you think things when your brain is trying to stay calm. This man is going to ruin my Tuesday. He was already ruining it, actually. I was running late for a meeting with a donor who wanted to discuss the restoration of a 17th century Dutch still life. And I had exactly 45 minutes to get across the city. And now there was a stranger with scarred hands and expensive shoes leaning on my 10-year-old Honda Civic like he owned it. "You're the conservator," he said. It wasn't a question. I worked at the Art Gallery of Ontario, 3rd floor, climate-controlled lab. Just me and whatever piece had come in for treatment that week. That month it was an oil-on panel portrait from the 1840s. A woman in a dark dress with eyes like she'd already seen everything that was going to happen and wasn't impressed. I spent 8 hours a day with that painting. I ate lunch with her. I talked to her sometimes, which I knew was strange. But when you spend that much time with a piece of art, you start to develop a relationship with it. You notice the way the light falls on her cheek, the tiny hairline cracks in the varnish, the way the artist signed his name in the lower right corner with a flourish that suggested he knew exactly how good he was. I was, by most measures, not a person who attracted attention from men with scarred knuckles. I was an omega, and I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be as invisible as possible. My suppressants were carefully calibrated, my scent blockers applied every morning without fail, my wardrobe chosen to blend in rather than stand out. I'd learned the hard way that being an omega in a world that expected you to be soft and pliant and available meant you had to build walls around yourself just to survive. "My name is Dr. Sebastian Cross," I said, and I was proud of how steady my voice came out. I had my keys in my hand, the metal digging into my palm, a small reassurance that I could get in my car and leave if I needed to. "And I don't know who you are." He didn't move. He just looked at me the way people look at things they've already decided to take. Not aggressive, just certain. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Dark hair that fell across his forehead like he'd been running his hands through it. A nervous habit that seemed out of place on someone with those hands. A jaw that could cut glass. High cheekbones. A nose that had been broken at least once. And eyes the color of winter light. Pale gray. Almost silver. The kind of eyes that seemed to see through you. He was wearing a coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Which was saying something, because I lived in a walk-up in Parkdale where the radiator made sounds like a dying animal, and the landlord had been promising to fix the plumbing since I moved in 3 years ago. The coat was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind of thing you saw in magazine spreads about men who had their lives together. He was alpha. I could smell it even through the expensive cologne he was wearing. That deep, resonant undertone of power and control. But it wasn't overwhelming, wasn't the aggressive pheromone flare that most alphas use to intimidate. This was something different. controlled, measured, like he was actively holding himself back. "Your name isn't important yet," he said. "Okay, move away from my car." He didn't. He just kept standing there, those pale eyes fixed on me, and I felt something shift in my chest. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. A pull, almost gravitational, that had nothing to do with logic or reason. "My brother's wedding is on Saturday," he said. "I need someone to attend with me." I actually laughed. It came out sharp and surprised, echoing off the concrete walls of the garage. "Good luck with that." "I'm not asking for luck. I'm asking for you." I should have gotten in my car. I know that now. I should have pushed past him, unlocked the door, and driven away without looking back. But my driver's side lock had been sticking for 3 weeks, and I hadn't gotten it fixed yet, and I didn't want to look like I was fumbling with a handle while trying to make a dramatic exit. Also, there was something about the way he was looking at me. Not desperate, not pleading, just certain. The way you look at something you've already decided is yours. So I stood there a beat too long, and in that beat, he said something that changed everything. "I know about the Belle-Fleur attribution." My stomach dropped so fast I felt it in my teeth. For a moment, the world tilted sideways, and I had to brace myself against the hood of my car to stay upright. The Belle-Fleur was a piece that had come through the lab 18 months ago, an estate donation from a wealthy Quebec family who had been collecting art for generations. Supposedly a minor work by a forgotten Quebec painter named Pierre Beaumont, an artist who had died in obscurity in the early 1900s. The painting was small, unremarkable, a woman in a garden, holding a flower, the kind of thing you'd find in a provincial museum storage room and forget about. Except I had found something under the surface. It was during a routine cleaning. I was removing a layer of yellowed varnish when I noticed something strange about the background. The brushstrokes were wrong. They were too confident, too precise, too much like a master's hand. I'd spent years studying the techniques of different painters, and I knew immediately that this was not the work of Pierre Beaumont. I used a microscope. I used infrared reflectography. I used everything in my arsenal to peel back the layers, and eventually, I found it. A signature buried under the paint. A different one. The signature of a much more famous artist. One whose work routinely sold for millions of dollars at auction. The discovery could redirect insurance valuations. It could completely recatalog a private collection. It could expose one of the most significant art frauds in Canadian history. I had written it up. I had submitted the report to my department head, a man named Gerald Whitmore who had been at the gallery for 30 years and who looked at me with patronizing affection whenever I got excited about something. And then the report had quietly disappeared into the administration's review process and never come out again. I had told exactly 2 people what I'd found. One was my best friend, Marcus, who lived in Vancouver and had no idea what any of it meant. The other was Gerald, who had told me very gently to let it rest. "How do you know about that?" I said. My voice sounded strange in my ears. Distant. "Because the family that donated that piece is connected to mine." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "And I need someone at that wedding who isn't." My mind was racing. The Belle-Fleur had been donated by the Ashford family. That much I knew. But the Ashfords were a pillar of Toronto society, philanthropists, art patrons, the kind of people who had their names on museum wings and hospital buildings. They were the last family you'd expect to be involved in art fraud. "Who are you?" I said. He didn't answer the question. He just looked at me with those winter-light eyes and said, "I'll explain everything. Somewhere away from this parking garage. You can say no, but I think you won't." His name, he told me eventually, was Julian Ashford. And yes, he'd heard every joke about the name already. No, he wasn't related to the actor. Yes, his mother had been obsessed with period dramas. And yes, he deeply resented it. His family ran a private equity firm headquartered in Toronto with offices in Calgary and Vancouver. Ashford Partners. Clean on paper. The kind of clean that takes considerable effort to maintain. The kind of clean that involved a small army of lawyers and accountants and public relations specialists who made sure nothing ever got written down in the wrong place. He wasn't the eldest. His brother, the one getting married, was. The brother was the face of the operation, the one who went to galas and gave interviews and made charitable donations that showed up in the society pages. He was the one whose face was on the company website. He was the one who smiled for cameras. Julian was something else. He didn't use words like enforcer or fixer, but he also didn't correct me when I used them. He had spent the last decade making problems disappear. He was very good at it. He knew how to find leverage. He knew how to apply pressure. He knew how to make people understand that cooperation was in their best interest without ever threatening them directly. He was, in every sense of the word, dangerous. But he was also something I hadn't expected, careful. The way he held himself, the way he chose his words, the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't the arrogance of an alpha who had never been told no. It was the caution of someone who had been hurt before and didn't want to be hurt again. And right now, his biggest problem was that someone at his brother's wedding was planning to make him disappear first. "You think there's going to be an attempt?" I said. We were sitting in a cafe on Queen Street by then, because he'd said, "Can we sit somewhere?" And I'd said, "I'm not going anywhere with you." And he'd said, "The Balzac's across the street," which was technically not going anywhere, just crossing a road, so somehow I'd agreed. I was drinking a Cordidu I didn't taste. The coffee was good. Balzac's always had good coffee, but I couldn't taste it. I could barely feel the warmth of the cup in my hands. "I know there's going to be an attempt," he said. "I just don't know which face it's coming from. And bringing me as a date solves this how exactly? It doesn't solve it. It gives me cover to watch for it." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The scars on his knuckles caught the light, silver against pale skin. If I come alone, I'm a target that's easy to isolate. If I come with someone unexpected, someone no one in my world has ever seen before, I'm harder to predict. "And you," he said, "will not be recognized by anyone in that room. I'm a museum conservator. I'm not a bodyguard. I know what you are. That's why I want you." There was something in the way he said it. Not flattery, exactly. Something more deliberate. Something that made my omega instinct stir in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. His scent was stronger here, in the enclosed space of the cafe. The expensive cologne was wearing off, and underneath it was the real him, something warm and deep, like cedar and smoke and the faintest hint of something metallic, like the smell of rain on concrete. I felt my body respond before my brain could stop it. The suppressants I took every morning were supposed to handle this. They were supposed to keep me from reacting to alphas, from feeling that pull, that gravitational tug that made omegas do stupid things like follow dangerous men into coffee shops. But Julian Ashford was not a stupid alpha, and something about him was getting past my defenses. "I'm not going to sleep with you," I said, because it seemed important to establish boundaries. "If that's what this is about." He looked genuinely startled. "That's not." He stopped, and a flush crept up his neck. "That's not what this is about." "Good. Then what is this about?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands, those scarred knuckles, and I saw something flicker across his face. Vulnerability. It was there, and then gone so fast I might have imagined it. I'm not good at this, he said. At asking for things. At trusting people. I've spent so long being the one who knows everything, who sees everything, who controls everything. And now I'm standing in a cafe with a stranger asking him to be my date to a wedding because I'm scared. You're scared? I'm cautious, he said. There's a difference. Julian. Something in my voice made him still. He looked up at me, and I saw the fear in his eyes. Just a thread of it. A crack in the armor. The alpha who had been so certain in the parking garage was now showing me something he probably hadn't shown anyone in years. I'm not afraid of them, he said. I'm afraid of what it means that I don't want to do this alone. I should say here that I did not agree immediately. I went home to my apartment in Roncesvalles. I fed my cat, who was named Miso because he was exactly the color of fermented soybean paste, and I sat on my couch and thought very seriously about calling the police. Then I thought about what I would say. A man in a parking garage told me he knows about a painting theft that went missing and he wants me to go to a wedding. And then I thought about Gerald's face when I'd mentioned the Belle Fleur. The way his eyes had gone just slightly too still. The way he put his hand on my shoulder and said, very gently, Sebastian, I think you should let this one go. I'd been so naive. I thought he was protecting me from the embarrassment of being wrong. I thought he was being kind. Now I wondered what he was really protecting. I texted Julian at 11:15 at night. What do I get out of this? He replied in under a minute. The Belle Fleur report in full, with the chain of custody documented. Enough to take to the press or the Provincial Arts Board, whichever you prefer. I stared at that message for a long time. Miso walked across my phone twice, his furry body blocking the screen. Fine, I typed. But I need to know the guest list. You'll have it by morning. I put my phone down and looked at Miso. He looked back at me with the settled calm of an animal that has never once in his life worried about anything. You are lucky, I told him. He blinked. The wedding was at a restored heritage property outside of Hamilton. One of those converted farmhouses that had become an event venue with exposed wood beams and Edison bulbs and a catering team from the city. Very tasteful. Very expensive. The kind of place where the gravel parking lot was somehow still elegant, where the landscaping looked effortless but had probably cost a fortune. I wore a suit I'd borrowed from my downstairs neighbor, a man named Diego who was a buyer for a fashion house and had approximately 40 times more formal wear than I did. Navy silk, off-shoulder, the kind of cut that made you stand up straighter just to wear it. Diego had also lent me shoes I was absolutely going to regret, black leather Oxfords with a slight heel that looked gorgeous, but were killing me by the time I got out of the Uber. I'd applied extra scent blockers that morning. I'd taken double my usual dose of suppressants. I'd told myself that this was a professional arrangement, nothing more, and that the way my heart had raced when Julian texted me the address meant absolutely nothing. Julian met me at the venue entrance. He was in a dark suit, no tie, top button open. The specific combination that manages to look intentional instead of careless. His dark hair was pushed back, showing the line of his jaw, the hollow of his throat. The scent of him hit me as I got closer, even through the blockers. That warm cedar and smoke thing, slightly stronger than it had been in the cafe, like he was nervous and couldn't completely suppress it. He looked at me the way people look at something that surprised them. His eyes traveled down my body and back up, and I felt the weight of that gaze like a physical touch. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. You look different, he said. From what? From a parking garage. That's a low bar, I said. He didn't smile, but something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly, like he was filing the moment away for later. like he was memorizing me. "You look good, Sebastian," he said quietly. "You look really good." I felt the flush creep up my neck. Flattery won't get you anything. Not everything has to be transactional, doesn't it? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know. Maybe not." The wedding itself was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are. His brother, a man named Elliot, broad-shouldered and visibly nervous in the best way, married his partner, a beta named Marcus who worked in tech and had the kind of easy smile that made everyone in the room feel welcome. The ceremony was in a glass-walled pavilion overlooking a pond, the autumn leaves in full color around them. There were wildflowers. There was a string quartet playing something by Beethoven. There was a toast from Marcus's father that made 3 people in our row cry. I spent the entire ceremony watching the guests instead. Julian had given me names. 17 people on the list who were, in his words, adjacent to situations that made him uncomfortable. He hadn't explained the situations. He'd just said, "If you see any of these people speaking to each other in a corner, or leaving and coming back, or watching me more than they watched the couple, I want to know." I had memorized the faces. It's something you learn in conservation work. Really looking at something, holding its details, the way light falls on a surface, what's underneath. I could see the layers in people the same way I could see them in paintings. The tension in someone's jaw, the way their eyes darted to the exits, the slight shift in their posture when they thought no one was watching. The reception was held in a barn that had been transformed into something out of a design magazine. During the cocktail hour, I circulated. I laughed at things. I refilled my glass of sparkling water twice. I was, by every external measure, a man enjoying a lovely Saturday. Internally, I was cataloging everything. At 40 minutes in, I found Julian near the bar and said quietly, "The man in the gray-blue jacket by the window has left and come back twice. He's been on his phone both times, but facing outward, not toward the building." Julian didn't look immediately. He picked up his drink, a glass of whiskey he was nursing slowly, and took a sip. "I see him." And the Omega in the burgundy dress spoke to him for about 90 seconds when he came back the second time. They don't seem to know each other socially. No greeting hug, no body language of familiarity. It was transactional. He looked at me then. Really looked. Those winter-light eyes studying me like I was a painting he couldn't quite figure out. How do you do that? 8 years of examining surfaces for what's underneath them, I said. It transfers. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? He was quiet for a moment. Someone soft. Someone who would be overwhelmed by all of this. Someone who would need to be protected. I'm not soft. I know. He reached out and touched my hand, just briefly, a brush of his fingers against mine. I know. What happened next happened fast, which is the thing they never tell you in the stories. You expect it to unspool slowly, like it does in films. Time slowing down, everything becoming significant. It doesn't work that way. It works the way accidents work. Very quickly, and then you're already in the middle of it. Julian's phone buzzed. He read it, and something changed in his face. Not much, but enough for me to catch it, which meant I was already watching him too carefully for my own good. "We need to move," he said. The man in the gray jacket just made a call to someone who is currently in the building. Not a guest. Someone who came in through the service entrance in the last 10 minutes. How do you know that? Because I have 2 alphas outside who are watching the doors. You said you came alone. I don't know who I can trust inside that building. Outside is different. He set down his glass. Can you walk in those shoes? I thought about this honestly. About 20 minutes before it becomes a medical issue. We have 15, he said. Follow me. We went through the kitchen, past catering staff who either didn't notice us or had been told not to, out a side door, and into the cold October air. I had left my coat inside, and the wind cut through my suit like a knife. Julian shrugged off his jacket without asking and put it over my shoulders, which would have been more romantic if we hadn't been moving at a pace that was technically jogging, but trying to look like a fast walk. Where are we going? I said. There's a path behind the barn that leads to the main road. My driver is parked 200 meters up. You have a driver? Yes. And Alpha's watching the doors? Yes. And yet you needed me specifically as a date. He glanced back at me. The moonlight caught the line of his jaw, the slight flush on his cheeks from the cold. His eyes were bright, focused, the predator in him awake and alert. My alphas can watch doors. They cannot walk into a room and notice things the way you just notice things. And they cannot make me look like a person who has stopped being afraid. I stopped walking. He stopped too, a few steps ahead, and turned. Around us the night was cold and dark, and smelled like wood smoke from somewhere, and the music from the barn was a faint thread behind us. The leaves rustled in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a car drove past. Are you afraid? I said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm cautious, he said. There's a difference. Julian. Something in my voice made him still. The scent of him shifted, barely, just a thread of something warmer underneath the blockers, something that made my omega instincts sit up and pay attention. He was hiding it. He was so good at hiding it. But I could feel it pulling at me, a gravity I hadn't asked for. I'm not afraid, he said slowly. But I'm not. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone see me. I've spent too long being the one who sees everyone else. I stepped closer. The jacket he'd given me was warm with his body heat, and underneath that I could smell him. That complicated scent, cedar and smoke and something else, something I couldn't name. You don't have to be afraid of me, I said. I'm not afraid of you. His voice was steadier now. I'm afraid of what it means that I'm not afraid of you. I reached out. My hand found his, those scarred knuckles, and I felt the tremor that ran through him. Come on, I said. We need to keep moving. He nodded, but he didn't let go of my hand. The driver's car was a black SUV that probably had very good tires, and I was extremely grateful to get into it and take off the borrowed shoes. I sat in the back with my feet bare on the floor mat and Julian's jacket still around my shoulders, and tried to think about what I had just walked out of. Your brother, I said. Does he know that someone might be trying to use his wedding as a location? No, and I would prefer he doesn't find out tonight. He's going to notice you left. I texted him. I said you were feeling unwell. He paused. I apologize for that. Did you at least make it something sympathetic? I said you'd eaten something. That could mean anything. That was intentional. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The lights of Hamilton passed outside the window, gas stations, fast food restaurants, the occasional house with a porch light on. Then the highway opened up, and the city sprawled in front of us like a circuit board. Thousands of lights flickering in the darkness. I was objectively in a car with an alpha I'd known for 4 days who operated in a world I had actively tried to stay away from my entire professional life. I was wearing his jacket. I had just helped surveil a wedding reception, and I could not stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me when he said he wasn't afraid. The Bellfleur report, I said. Is it real? What you promised. It's real. I have it. Why? He was quiet again. Different kind of quiet this time. The kind where someone is deciding how much to say. Because the family that made it disappear did so to protect a larger arrangement. One that involves people I have been watching for a while. The painting documentation is one piece of a larger financial structure that is at present very difficult to untangle. You're building a case. I'm building something. Against who? People who have spent a long time doing business in this country behind the shelter of philanthropy and arts funding. Donations to institutions. Charitable trusts. The kind of clean money that actually isn't. I thought about the woman in the 1840s portrait. Eyes like she'd already seen everything. How many pieces like the Belle Fleur are there? I said. At least 11 that I know of. Possibly more. And the institutions that accepted them. Some of them know. Some of them don't. The ones that know are more complicated. I let that sit. Outside, the highway lights were orange and steady and very normal. What happens now? I said. Tonight. You go home. I make sure you get there safely. Tomorrow, my team will have identified the 2 people at the reception, and I'll know which family they came from. And then, he paused. Then I'll know where to push. We pulled up to my street at 11:30. The driver didn't get out. Julian walked me to my building door, which was a thing I found I noticed more than I expected to. Your jacket, I said, starting to take it off. Keep it. It's cold. Julian. He turned. The street light caught his face, and for a moment he looked almost young, the tension gone, something open and uncertain in his expression. You were good in there, he said. You were very good. I just looked at things. Most people don't actually look at anything. I stood there with my shoes in one hand and his jacket on and the night air on my bare arms, and I thought about the fact that my job was to look at what was underneath surfaces, and that I had been spending the last 4 days looking at this alpha, and still hadn't entirely figured out what was there. Sebastian. Julian. He stepped closer. The scent of him wrapped around me, and I felt the omega in my chest start to tremble. It was involuntary, that response, a pull that came from somewhere primal, somewhere I'd spent years trying to suppress. Did you just, he started, and then stopped. His eyes were dark in the dim light. You're trembling. I'm fine. You're not fine. He reached out. His hand, those scarred knuckles, touched my jaw, just barely. His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone, and I stopped breathing. Julian. I don't know what this is, he said softly. I don't know how to do this. But I don't want to walk away from you. You don't have to. He leaned in. For a second, I thought he was going to kiss me, and then he didn't. He pressed his forehead against mine, and I felt the warmth of him, the faint tremble in his shoulders, the way his pheromones leaked through the blockers like a secret. I'm going to fix this, he said. The case, the paintings, everything. And then, I'm going to come find you. I'll be here, I said. He pulled back. His eyes were bright in the dim light, and I saw something there that I hadn't seen before. Something that looked like hope. Get inside, he said. Lock the door. You're not my alpha, I said, but I said it without heat. No, he said, but I'd like to be. What happened before Monday was that they came for him on Sunday morning. He called me at 7:42. I know the exact time because my phone was still on my nightstand and I saw the numbers when I picked it up. Miso was asleep on my feet. The radiator was clicking. Very ordinary Sunday morning things. Don't go outside, he said. Julian, don't go to the gallery. Don't go anywhere. What's happening? The Omega from the reception. Her name is Crispin Beaumont, and she is currently cooperating with 2 alphas who have decided that the case I am building is too close to completion. His voice was even, controlled, not afraid. Cautious. They know you were with me last night. I need you to stay where you are. Julian, I am handling it. I need you to trust me for approximately 4 hours. I don't actually trust you. A short pause. Fair, he said. But please stay inside anyway. I stayed inside. I fed Miso. I made coffee and drank it at my kitchen table and tried to read a paper about solvent ratios in oil paint conservation and could not absorb a single sentence. The words swam in front of my eyes. My mind kept going back to Julian, to the way he'd looked at me in the parking garage, to the way he'd held my hand in the car, to the way he'd pressed his forehead against mine like I was something precious. At 10:15, I texted him. Still alive? Yes, he replied. Beaumont made a mistake. She contacted someone she thought was on her side. Was that person on her side? No. I put my phone down and looked at Miso, who looked back at me with the settled calm of an animal that has never once in his life worried about anything. You are lucky, I told him. He blinked. By noon, Julian was at my door. He looked tired in a way that I hadn't seen on him before. Not afraid. Used. Like something had been spent. His eyes had dark circles under them, and there was a cut on his cheek that hadn't been there yesterday. A thin line, still red, that looked like it had been made by something sharp. Julian. I pulled him inside. What happened to your face? Nothing serious. He waved it away. Beaumont got a little creative before we could contain her. She hurt you. She tried. He gave me a small, tired smile. I've had worse. He was carrying coffee from the place on Roncesvalles Avenue. 2 cups, which made me feel things I wasn't entirely ready to examine. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with his scent, that cedar and smoke thing, and I had to physically stop myself from pulling him into my arms. It's contained, he said. Beaumont has been. He seemed to consider the word. Removed from the situation. Removed how? Removed in a way that does not require you to ask more questions than you want answers to. We sat in my kitchen. His jacket from last night was still draped over my spare chair, and he put a file folder on the table. His hands were shaking slightly, I noticed. Just a tremor. Barely visible. The Bellefleur report. I opened it. It was everything I had found, plus 3 additional expert assessments, plus the original chain of custody documents, plus a paper trail showing exactly who had authorized the suppression and why. It was all there. Names. Dates. Financial transactions. A web of lies that had been carefully constructed over decades. There are also 11 other files, he said. On the drive. He slid a USB across the table. Everything I have. The financial structure. The provenance fraud. The trust arrangements. The full picture. I picked up the drive. What am I supposed to do with this? Whatever you think is right. He met my eyes. You're the one who looks at things and sees what's actually there. I trust your judgment about what this should become. I thought about this for a while. Miso jumped up on the table between us, which he absolutely was not supposed to do, and I let him because I wasn't in a position to enforce anything. The Provincial Arts Board, I said finally, and the AGO Ethics Committee. And I looked at the file. I know a journalist at the Globe. She covers arts philanthropy. Those are all good choices. And Elliot, your brother. Does he know who he's related to? Something passed across Julian's face then. Complicated and quick. Pain and guilt and something that looked like shame. Elliot is clean. He's always been clean. He chose a different path a long time ago, and my family let him. Because he was the visible one. Easier that way. He looked at his coffee cup. He doesn't know what I do. He thinks I work in risk consulting. Do you want him to keep thinking that? I think he stopped. Started again. I think the right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same. And I have spent a long time doing things that were necessary, but not right. I don't know what Elliot will do with the truth, but I think he deserves it. I nodded slowly. Also, he said, your parking validation ticket from Tuesday. I think you dropped it. He reached into his coat pocket and put it on the table. I stared at it. You kept that. I found it on the ground after you drove away. I don't know why I kept it. A habit. He looked mildly embarrassed, which was the most human I had seen him look in 5 days. You can throw it out. I didn't throw it out. I don't know why. The Provincial Arts Board investigation opened in February. The Globe piece ran in March. And by April, there were 3 institutions under review and 2 civil suits filed against the estate of the family who had arranged the Bellfleur suppression. The painting itself was recatalogued correctly. It now hangs under the right name in the right part of the permanent collection, with the full attribution documented. I went to see it the day it was reinstalled. The woman in the dark dress looked out at me with her knowing eyes, and I thought about all the layers that had been hiding underneath. I testified to the Arts Board in April. It took most of a Wednesday and a very aggressive Crown Counsel and one extremely good lawyer on my side, who I did not ask too many questions about who had retained. The lawyer was a beta named Parker who was professional and efficient and never once asked me why I was involved. I saw Julian twice in those months. Once by accident, on Queen Street. Both of us with coffee. Both of us not knowing what to say. Both of us eventually saying hello. How is this going? Fine. Okay. I wanted to ask him how he was, if he was okay, if the cut on his cheek had healed, but the words wouldn't come. Once not by accident, in the spring, when he appeared at the gallery during my lunch break and asked if I wanted to walk along Bloor for 20 minutes. We walked for 2 hours. We talked about the case, and then about things that were not the case. He asked about the 1840s portrait. I told him she had been returned to a descendant of the original family who had been looking for her for 40 years, and who had cried on the phone when we called with the news. He told me that Elliot and his husband had gotten a dog, a massive golden retriever named something ridiculous that he refused to say out loud, but eventually wrote on a napkin at the coffee shop we'd ended up in. Biscotti. I said, your brother named his dog Biscotti? He did. Your brother seems like the best person in your family. He is, Julian said without any bitterness. By a significant margin. I folded the napkin and put it in my coat pocket, next to the parking validation ticket I still hadn't thrown away. I missed you, I said. The words came out before I could stop them. He looked at me. His eyes were bright, and something in his face softened. I missed you too, he said. In June, Miso got a clean bill of health at the vet, and I texted Julian a photo because he had asked once, in passing, how the cat was. I'd said fine, and then immediately wondered why he knew to ask about the cat at all, and then remembered that I had mentioned Miso on the drive home from the wedding, when I was tired and not being careful. He replied to the photo, good. I was concerned. About my cat? You mention him like he matters to you. So yes. I sat with that for a moment. Then I typed, there's a talk at the gallery next Thursday. An expert from Montreal on provenance research and fraud prevention. It's open to the public. I thought you might find it interesting. 3 minutes passed. I'll be there. He sat in the back, and I sat at the front because I was part of the panel. I could feel him watching me the whole time, his gaze like a weight on my skin. I stumbled over my words twice, which never happened. The other panelists gave me strange looks. Afterward, when most people had left, he came and stood beside me while I was looking at the 1840s woman's replacement in the collection. A different portrait, similar era, woman in a dark dress, different kind of eyes. This one had a smaller smile, a more knowing expression, like she was in on a joke I hadn't been told. "What's underneath this one?" he said. "No idea yet. She only came in last month. But there's something. There's always something." I looked at him. "You just have to know where to look." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about doing something different. With the information side of things. More transparent. Something that could actually be used rather than just held." He glanced at me. "I could use someone who knows how to look at things and see what's actually there." "That's a very cautious way to ask something," I said. "I'm a cautious person. I know." I turned back to the portrait, but I could feel him next to me, that warm scent, the careful way he held himself, and I wanted to turn and pull him close and not let go. "Sebastian." "Julian. I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to be with someone. I've spent my whole life being alone. It was easier." "Was it?" "No." The word came out like a confession. It wasn't. It was just what I knew. I reached for his hand. His scarred knuckles, warm in my palm. He looked down at our fingers, intertwined, and I felt the tremor that ran through him. "You don't have to be alone anymore," I said. He looked up at me. There were tears in his eyes, not falling, just there, like the suggestion of them, and I understood that this was maybe the first time he'd ever let anyone see him like this. "I don't know how to do this," he repeated. "Neither do I. We'll figure it out." He laughed, a wet, surprised sound. "That's not very reassuring. It's honest. That's why I trust you." Outside on Dundas Street, the summer evening was still warm. The city was doing the thing it does in June where everything smells like cut grass and exhaust and lake water. Julian held the door open, and I walked through, and my hand found his again like it belonged there. Misa was at home, probably asleep in a square of fading sunlight, completely unburdened by everything that had happened. Some things, I thought, turn out to contain more than you expected. You just have to be willing to look long enough to find them. "I'm going to kiss you now," Julian said. "Is that okay?" I stopped. Yes, that's okay." He stepped closer. His hand came up to my jaw, those scarred knuckles gentle against my skin, and when he kissed me it was soft and careful and tasted like coffee and something sweeter underneath. I pulled him closer. His body was warm against mine, and I could feel his heart beating fast, and I thought, this is what it means. This is what they never tell you. It's not about control. It's about letting go. We pulled apart eventually. The street was quiet. The stars were coming out, faint against the city glow. "I have a confession," Julian said. "What?" "I don't actually need to work with you on the case. I just wanted an excuse to see you again." I laughed. "You already had a reason. You kissed me." "I know." He smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from him. The kind that reached his eyes and made his whole face look different. I wanted to back up. "Julian." "Sebastian." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. His smile faded, but not into sadness. Into something quieter, something that looked like hope. "Neither am I," he said. We walked back to my apartment with our hands intertwined. The streets of Roncesvalles were quiet, the restaurants closing up, the last few patrons spilling out onto the sidewalks. Miso was waiting at the door, unimpressed by our arrival, and I realized that this was my life now. This alpha, this cat, this strange and terrifying and wonderful thing that had happened to me. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how the rest of the case would unfold, or what Julian's family would do, or whether we would make it work. But I knew that when I looked at him, I saw something underneath all the surfaces. Something real. Something worth protecting. And I knew I would. The Arts Board investigation continued through the summer. Julian and I spent weekends together, awkward and careful, and slowly learning how to be people who weren't alone. He cooked me dinner and burned it. I showed him how to identify forgeries. He told me about his family, piece by painful piece, and I told him about mine. The father who'd never accepted my omega nature. The mother who'd left when I was 12. The years I'd spent trying to be small enough to not be noticed. He touched my face when I talked about it, like he was trying to memorize the shape of me. I don't want to change you, he said once. I just want to be with you. You don't have to change me. You just have to stay. I will, he said. And I believed him. In September, the Globe ran a follow-up piece. 3 more institutions were under review. Julian's family's firm was being investigated for money laundering. The Ashford name, which had once been synonymous with philanthropy, was now associated with fraud and corruption. Elliot called Julian furious, demanding answers. Julian called me afterward. He was shaking. He knows, he said. He knows everything. He's so angry. He doesn't want to see me. He'll come around, I said. How do you know? Because he loves you. And because love means you don't give up on people. Julian was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I love you. The words hung between us. I felt them settle into my chest like something I'd been waiting for my whole life. I love you too, I said. By November, things had settled. The case was still ongoing, but the worst of it was done. Elliot came around eventually, angry and hurt, but not gone. He and Julian talked for hours on the phone, rebuilding what had been broken. The dog, Biscotti, became a regular presence in their conversations, a neutral subject they could both agree on. Julian moved in with me in December. He brought a box of things, clothes, books, a few photographs, and his scent, and his careful, cautious heart. Miso ignored him for 3 days, and then decided he was acceptable. By the end of the week, they were sharing the couch, Miso curled up in Julian's lap like he'd always been there. On Christmas Eve, we sat on the couch and watched the snow fall outside the window. The city was quiet, muffled by the white blanket, and the apartment was warm and smelled like the mulled wine Julian had made from a recipe he'd found online. I used to think I was broken, Julian said quietly. I used to think alphas were supposed to be hard. And I was never hard. I was sharp and I was cold and I was alone. You're not alone now. I know. He leaned into me, his head on my shoulder. I know. I wrapped my arm around him and felt the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. You're not broken, I said. You're just a different kind of person. And there's nothing wrong with that. I thought omegas were supposed to be soft. I thought so too. And then I met you, and I realized that softness isn't about weakness. It's about being there when someone needs you. He looked up at me. His eyes were bright in the Christmas lights, reflecting the colors like a stained glass window. Sebastian, Julian, I'm going to kiss you now. Good, I said. The 1840s portrait still hangs in the gallery. The woman in the dark dress looks out at visitors with her knowing eyes, and I stop by sometimes on my lunch breaks to say hello. I think about what it means to look at something and see what's underneath. I think about the Belle Fleur and the years of deception and the people who thought they could hide the truth under layers of paint and paperwork. I think about Julian. I think about the way he looked at me in that parking garage, certain and scared and determined all at once. I think about the way he held my hand in the car, his fingers intertwined with mine like he was afraid I'd disappear. I think about the way he kissed me on Dundas Street, like I was something precious, something worth being careful with. I think about all the things we keep without knowing why. Parking validation tickets. Napkins with silly names. The careful, fragile, terrifying thing that is being vulnerable with someone else. Some things, I tell the portrait, are worth looking for. She doesn't answer. She doesn't have to. In February, Julian proposed. It was not dramatic. It was not romantic. We were in the kitchen, and I was trying to fix the radiator, which had started making that dying animal sound again, and he walked in with coffee and said, "Sebastian." "What?" He put the coffee down. He got on one knee. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I have this." He held up the parking validation ticket from that first day. The little scrap of paper, worn and folded, the ink barely legible. I kept it. I know it's stupid, but I kept it because it was the first thing you gave me, and I didn't know then what I was holding on to. "Julian, I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And I know that's terrifying, and I know we still have things to figure out, but I don't want to figure them out with anyone else." I stared at him. The Omega in me was trembling. I wanted to say yes, to fall into his arms, to let myself be claimed and protected and loved. But I held back. "Sebastian, yes, 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 I'll marry you." He laughed. That surprised, wet sound I loved. That was easier than I expected. "Shut up and kiss me." He did. The radiator was still broken. Miso was watching from the table, his amber eyes unblinking. The coffee was getting cold. But I had this alpha in my arms, this sharp, careful, impossible alpha who had walked into my life in a parking garage and changed everything. I had him, and I was never letting go. The wedding was in October. The same venue outside Hamilton, because Elliot insisted. Julian had wanted something smaller, something quieter, but Elliot had said, "You got me through mine. I'm getting you through yours." It was beautiful. Wildflowers and string quartet, and a toast from Elliot that made everyone cry, including Elliot himself, who had to stop twice to compose himself. Julian wore a dark suit. No tie. I wore navy silk. We stood under the exposed wood beams and said our vows, and I looked at him and saw everything underneath the surface. All the fear, all the bravery, all the love. "I will always find you," I said, "and I will always keep you." He smiled. His hand found mine. "I know," he said. The first thing I noticed about him wasn't his face. It was his hands, scarred, careful, holding on to something he didn't know how to name. Now I know what he was holding on to. It was me. Afterward, we went back to the apartment in Roncesvalles. Miso was waiting at the door, unimpressed by our absence. The radiator was still making that sound, and the pipes in the kitchen still rattled when you turned on the hot water. We sat on the couch in our wedding clothes, too tired to change, and watched the snow fall outside the window. "I have something else to tell you," Julian said. "What?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not the parking validation ticket that was framed and hung on the wall now. A ridiculous piece of memorabilia that made me smile every time I saw it. "This is from the arts board," he said. "They want to hire you as a consultant to investigate Providence fraud." I stared at him. "What?" "There's a new initiative. They need someone who knows what to look for. Someone who can see what's underneath." He smiled. "I may have mentioned your name. Julian. You don't have to take it. But I thought you should know." I took the paper and read it. It was formal, bureaucratic, full of legal language. But at the end, there was an invitation, a request, an opportunity. "Sebastian." I looked up. Julian was watching me with those winter-light eyes, and for a moment, I saw all the layers. All the fear and bravery and love that he'd hidden for so long. "I'll take it," I said, "but only if you come with me. To the arts board? To everything. To all of it. I don't want to do any of it without you." He leaned forward. His hand came up to my jaw, those scarred knuckles gentle against my skin, and he kissed me. "You've got a deal," he said. The first thing I noticed about him wasn't his face. It was his hands. Now I look at them every day. I hold them when we walk. I kiss them when I'm tired. I trace the scars and think about everything they've done, everything they've held, everything they've protected, everything they've let go. Some things, I think, turn out to contain more than you expected. You just have to be willing to look long enough to find them. I found him, and I'm never letting go.